Good morning, boys and girls. Here's Winnie, and we are today going to talk about something new. So we're in our transportation class, and oh, I hear something. Well, all the livelong day, I've been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. Oh, Winnie, I think we're talking about railroads today. Right, Winnie? Okay, off you go. I have lots of work to do. Boys and girls, the development of the railroads was one of the most important in the Industrial Revolution. The modern railroad, as we know it today, was first developed in Great Britain in about 1815. That's 200 years ago. Well, then in 1849, you know that it took the pioneers more than 3 months to cross the United States. What a long, hard trek that was. People crossed America on horseback, by oxen pulling wagons, or by long wagon trains. And it took them 3 months, and it costed about $1,500 to go from coast to coast. Well, that would never do. Something had to happen. So they conceived the idea of having a railroad going all the way across our country. Why? Well, it would allow goods to be moved more rapidly and cheaply across the country instead of having to go all the way around Cape Horn, around South America, and it would encourage settlement of our entire country. So they wanted people to settle this country. But like I mentioned before, the railroad, before the railroad was invented, people crossed America on horseback, as I said, by oxen and long wagon trains. Stagecoaches were a little faster, but they couldn't haul or transport goods, so that was no good either. So the building of the Transcontinental, means across the continent, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad united our nation from coast to coast and increased communication between the east and the west coasts. No longer would people have to travel by these long wagon trains and take months to reach California. They could travel they could travel faster, they could travel safer, and they could travel cheaper. In addition, things like mail and supplies and trade goods could now be shipped across the country in just a few days instead of having to take all that time before. So President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, and construction started on the Transcontinental Railroad in 1863. The railroad began in Omaha, Nebraska, and was going to go all the way to Sacramento, California. Now, there were 2 companies involved in building this railroad: the Central Pacific, which began in Sacramento, and the Union Pacific, which began in Omaha, Nebraska. Do you know there were about 30,000 workers involved to build the railroads? Irish laborers worked for the Union Pacific. Mormon settlers worked in the Utah territories, and Chinese immigrants, for the most part, worked for the Central Pacific Railroad. Now, the Central Pacific Railroad had to deal with mountains, with snow. They had to blast tunnels, and really they could only blast about 1 foot a day. The Union Pacific, on the other hand, well, they had to deal with Native American raids because the railroad was going right through their land. So that was a huge problem. Well, finally, the 2 railroads met at Promontory Summit in Utah on May the 10th, 1869, and Leland Stanford, of Stanford University fame, he drove the golden spike into the railroads with a silver hammer. The total length of the first transcontinental railroad was 1,776 miles. So there were really good things, but you know, there were also things that were not so good. Nearly everything they needed to build the railroads, the lumber, the rails, the spikes, everything had to be shipped from the East Coast. Either it had to go around South America by ship, or it had to cross the continent. There were no bridges, there were no roads, so it took a long time and things were very difficult. The Native Americans were very, very unhappy because they were losing their way of life since the railroad was cutting right through their land, and that caused huge problems. And then thirdly, immense buffalo herds were destroyed. Do you know that in 1850, it's estimated there were 60 million bison buffalo herds? There were less than 1,000 bison in 1900. That is so sad. Today, fortunately, in 2020, the herds are slowly coming back, and now there are about 360,000 of them. So that's getting better. So, before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast, it took 3 months and the cost was $1,500 to travel. When the railroad was finished, it took 7 days and the cost was $150. Wow, what a difference. Oh, well, here's Buddha, just as we're finishing. I hope that you've learned a lot about the Transcontinental Railroad, and you know what? I will see you next week. Bye-bye for now.